Welcome, fellow travelers, to the halls of the mind. I am Serotonin 2501, and this is Audio Arcanum. Join me in a journey into your imagination as we travel through various realms held on the pages of books both known and unknown. This episode, we will be reading from the first book of the Wayfarer Redemption series by Sarah Douglas. This book was published in 1995 under the name Battle Axe, Book 1 of the Axis trilogy, and is now known simply as the Wayfarer Redemption. Sit back, relax, and let your mind be free as we journey into the pages of the Wayfarer Redemption. The Prophecy of the Destroyer. A day will come when born will be two babes whose blood will tie them. That born to wing and horn will hate the one they call the Starman. Destroyer rises in the north and drives his ghost men south. Defenseless lie both flesh and field before Gorogrel's ice. To meet this threat you must release the Starman from his lies. Revive Tensador, fast and sure. Forget the ancient war. For if plow, wing, and horn can't find the bridge to understanding, then will Gorogrel earn his name and bring destruction hither. Starman, listen and heed me well. Your power will destroy you, if you should wield it in the fray ere these prophecies are met. The sentinels will walk abroad till power corrupts their hearts. A child will turn her head and cry, revealing ancient arts. A wife will hold in joy at night the slayer of her husband. Age-old souls long in cribs will sing o'er mortal land. The remade dead, fat with child, will birth abomination. A darker power will prove to be the father of salvation. Then waters will release bright eyes to form the rainbow scepter. Starman, listen, for I know that you can wield the scepter to bring Gorogrel to his knees and break the ice asunder. But even with the power in hand, your pathway is not sure. A traitor from within your camp will seek and plot to harm you. Let not your lover's pain distract, for this will mean your death. Destroyer's might lies in his hate, yet you must never follow. Forgiveness is the thing assured to save Tensador's soul. Prologue. The woman struggled through the knee-deep snow, a bundle of dead wood she had tied to her back, almost as great a burden as the weight of the child she carried in her belly. Her breath rasped in her throat before frosting heavily in the bitterly cold southerly wind. She was short and strong, her legs and shoulders finely muscled by 28 years of hard-worn survival in her harsh homeland. But she had always had the help and company of her people to aid her. Now she was alone, and this, her third child, she would have to bear without assistance. This would be her last trip across the valley. The severe winter storms of the past few weeks had kept her iced into her shelter so that her supply of precious hot-burning time wood was almost exhausted. If she did not have enough wood and dry stores remaining for her confinement, then she would die and her child would die with her. Only the past day had the weather broken sufficiently to allow her to struggle through the snow to reach the time wood trees. Now the wind was growing harsher and the snow heavier, and she knew she had only a short time to reach her shelter. The knowledge that once the baby was born she would not be able to travel far from her shelter drove her on. Although her current solitude was a path she had chosen freely, worry ate at her bones. Worry about her child also gnawed at her. Her previous two pregnancies had been uncomfortable, especially in the final weeks, but she had borne those children with little fuss. Her body had recuperated quickly and had healed cleanly each time. With this child she feared labor more than the lonely winter ahead. It was too large, too angry. Sometimes at night when she was trying to sleep, it twisted and beat at the sides of her womb with such frantic fists and heels that she moaned in pain, rocking herself from side to side in a futile attempt to escape its rage. She paused briefly, adjusting the burden of wood on her back, wishing she could ease the loaded child as easily. Last night it had shifted down into the pit of her belly, seeking the birth canal. The birth was close. Perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow. She could feel the bones of her pelvis grating apart with the pressure of the child's head each time she took a step, making it hard to walk. She squinted through the snow to the thick line of conifers about 300 paces ahead. She had done her best with her camp. It was sheltered well behind the tree line, in the lee of a rocky hill that, jutting above the peaks of the trees, was the first in a long range of hills leading to the distant ice-carved Alps. Well before her pregnancy had begun to show, she had slipped away from her friends and family and traveled the Avarenheim to reach this lonely spot far to the north of her usual forest home. From the first autumn months, Dead Leaf Month, she had occupied her days with gathering and stowing as many berries, nuts, and seeds as she could. As hard as she searched, however, she had found only small amounts of malafari, the sweet fibrous tubers that provided her and her people with most of their winter sustenance. She had been forced to go without and fears of what malnourishment might do to her and her child kept her awake at nights. The remains of a few scrawny rabbits, dried into leathery strips, were all she had for meat. She sighed and absently rubbed her belly, trying to ignore the fiery ache in her legs and pelvis, desperately wishing for a few chickens or a goat to supplement her diet. She would never have tried to carry this child to term. Had she remained with her people, she would not have been allowed to. It was a Beltide child, conceived during the drunken revelry of the spring rites, a time when her people, the forest dwellers, and the people of the ice-carved Alps, assembled in the groves where mountain and forest meet. It was there they celebrated the renewal of life in the thawing of land of religious rites, followed invariably by an enthusiastic excess of whatever wine left over from the long winter nights huddled by home fires. Beltide was the one night of the year when both people relaxed sufficiently to carry interracial relations to extremes never practiced throughout the rest of the year. Every Beltide night for the past 3 years she had watched him, wanted him. He came down from the groves with his people, his skin pale and fine as the ice vaults of his home, his hair the fine summer gold of the life-giving sun that both their peoples worshipped. As the most powerful enchanter of his kind, he led the Beltide rites with the leading banes of her own people. His power and magic awed and frightened her, yet she craved his skill, beauty, and grace. This last Beltide night passed 8 months ago now. She had drunk enough wine to loosen her inhibition and buttress her courage. She was a striking woman, at peak of her beauty and fitness, her nut-brown hair waving thick down her back. When he'd seen her striding across the clearing of the grove toward him, his eyes had crinkled and then widened, and then he smiled and held his hand out to her. Eyes trapped in his, she had taken his outstretched fingers, marveling in the feel of his silken skin against her own work-calloused palm. He was kind for an enchanter, and had murmured gentle words before leading her to a secluded spot beneath the spinning stars. "Stardrifter," she whispered, running her tongue along the split skin of her lips. The snow had been drifting down for the past few hours, as now falling heavily, and she roused from her revelry to find she could hardly see the tree line through the drifting snow. She must hurry. His child was dragging her down. She stumbled a little as she tried to move faster. Her hands had been strong and confident on her body, and she was not surprised that her womb had quickened with his child. A child of his would be so amazing, so exceptional. And although both people accepted the excess and the drunken unions between the races of Beltide night, both also insisted that each child conceived of such union was an abomination. For most of her life she had been aware of the woman who, some 4 or 6 weeks after Beltide, went out of their way along the dim forest path to collect the herbs necessary to rid their bodies of any child conceived that night. Somehow she had not been able to force herself to swallow the steaming concoction she brewed herself time and time again, and finally she had decided she would carry the child to term. Once the child was born, once her people would see now that it was a babe like any other, except more beautiful, more powerful as any child of an enchanter would be, they would accept it. No child of hers would be an abomination. She had to spend the last long months of her pregnancy alone, lest her people force the child from her body. Now she wondered if the child would be as wondrous as she had first supposed, or whether she'd made a mistake. She clenched her jaws against the discomfort and forced her feet to take one step after another through the snowdrifts. She would manage. She had to. She did not want to die. Suddenly, a strange whisper, barely discernible from the heightened storm, ran along the edge of the wind. She stopped, every nerve in her body afire. Her gloved hands pushed fine strands of hair from her eyes, and she concentrated hard, peering through the gloom, listening for any unusual sounds. There, again. A soft whisper among the wind, a soft whisper and a hiccup. Skraelings. Ah, she moaned, involuntary terror clutching at her stomach. After a moment frozen in the wind, she fumbled with the cumbersome straps holding the bundle of wood at her back, desperate to lose the burden. Her only hope of survival lay in outrunning the Skraelings, in reaching the trees before they reached her. They did not like the trees. But she could not run at this point in her pregnancy, not with this child. The straps finally broke free, the wood tumbling about her feet, and she stumbled forward. Almost immediately she tripped and fell over, hitting the ground heavily as the impact forced the breath out of her body and sending a shaft of agony through her belly. The child kicked viciously. The wind whispered again, closer. For a few moments she could do nothing but scrabble around in the snow, frantically trying to regain her breath and find some foot or handhold in the treacherous ground. A small burble of laughter, low, barely audible above the wind, sounded a few paces to her left. Sobbing with terror now, she lurched to her feet, everything but the need to get to safety of the trees forgotten. 2 paces later, another whisper, this time directly behind her, and she could have screamed, except that her child kicked so suddenly and directly into her diaphragm that she was winded almost as badly as she'd been when she'd fell. Then, and even more terrifying, a whisper directly in front of her. A pretty, a tasty. The wraith's insubstantial face appeared momentarily in the dusk light, its silver orbs glowing obscenely, its tooth-lined jaws hanging loose with desire. Finally, she found the breath to scream, the sound tearing through the dusk light, and she stumbled directly to the right, fighting through the snow, arms wailing in a futile effort to fend the wraiths off. She knew that she was almost certainly doomed. The wraith fed on fear as much as they fed on flesh, and they were growing as her terror grew. She could feel the strength draining out of her. They would chase her, taunt her, drain her until even fear was gone. Then they would feed off her body. The child churned in her belly as she lurched through the snow, as if intent on escaping a prison of her poor doomed body. It flailed with its fists and heels and elbows, and every time one of the dreaded whispers of the wraith reached it through the amniotic fluid of its mother's womb, it twisted and struck harder. Even though she knew she was all but doomed, the primeval urge to keep making the effort to escape kept her moving through the snow, grunting with each step, jerking every time a child beat within the confines of her womb. But now the urge to escape consumed the child as much as the mother. The 5 wraiths hung back a few paces in the snow, enjoying the woman's fear. The chase was going well. Then, strangely, the woman twisted and jerked mid-step and crashed to the ground, writhing and clutching at the heaving mound of her belly. The wraiths, surprised by the sudden development in the chase, had to sidestep quickly out of the way and slowed to circle the woman at a safe distance just out of arm's reach. She screamed. It was a sound of such terror, wrenched from the very depths of her body, that the wraiths moaned in ecstasy. She turned to the nearest wraith, extending its hand for mercy. "Help me," she whispered. "Please, help me." The wraiths had never been asked for help before. They began to mill in confusion. Was she no longer afraid of them? Why was that? Wasn't every flesh-and-blood creature afraid of them? Their minds communed, and they wondered if perhaps they should be afraid too. The woman convulsed, and the snow stained bright red about her hips. The smell and sight of warm blood reached the wraiths, reassuring them. This one was going to die more quickly than they had originally expected. Spontaneously, without any help of their sharp-pointed fangs. Sad, but she would still taste sweet. They drifted about in the freezing wind, watching, waiting, wanting. After a few more minutes, the woman moaned once quietly and then lay still, her face alabaster, her eyes open and glazed, her hands slowly unclenching. The wraiths bobbed as the wind gusted through them and considered. The chase had started so well. She had feared well, but she had died strangely. The most courageous of the 5 drifted up to the woman and considered her silently for a moment longer. Finally, the coppery smell of warm blood decided it, and it reached down with an insubstantial claw to worry at the leather thongs of her tunic. After a moment's resistance, the leather fell open, and the one adventurous wraith was so surprised it leapt back to the safe of the circling distance with its comrades. In the bloody mess that had once been the woman's belly laid a child, glaring defiantly at them, hate seeping from every one of its bloodied pores. It had eaten its way out. Ooh, the wraiths cooed in delight, and the more courageous of them drifted forward again and picked up the bloody child. "It hates," it whispered at the others. "Feel it?" The other wraiths bobbed closer, emotion closing to affection, misting their orbs. The child turns its tusked head and glared at the wraiths. It hiccuped, and a small burble of blood frothed from the corner of its mouth. Ah, the wraiths cooed again and huddled over the baby. Without a word, they made their monumentous decision. They would take it home. They would feed it. And in time, they would learn to love it. And then, years into the future, the wraiths could not discern. They would learn to worship it. But now they were hungry, and good food was cooling to one side. Appalling as it was, the baby was dumped unceremoniously in the snow, howling its rage as the wraiths fed on its dead mother. 6 weeks later. Separated by the lengths of the Alps and still more race and circumstance, another woman struggled through the snowdrifts of the lower reaches of the western ice-carved Alps. She fell badly over a rock by the snow and tore the last fingernail from her once soft white hands as she scrabbled for purchase. She huddled against the frozen rock and sucked her finger, moaning in frustration and almost crying through cold and sad-heartedness. For a day and night she had battled to keep alive ever since they had dumped her here in the barren landscape. These mountains could kill even the fittest man, and she was seriously weakened by the terrible birth of her son 2 days before. And despite all her trivial and prayers and tears and curses, he had died during that birth, born so still and blue that the midwives had huddled him away, not letting her hold him or weep over him. And then as the midwives fled the birthing chamber, the 2 men had come in, their eyes cold and derisive, their mouths twisted with scorn. They had dragged her, weeping and bleeding, from the room, dragging her from her life of comfort and defiance and deference, dumping her into the splintered old cart, and drove her throughout the day to the spot at the base of the ice-carved Alps. They had said not a word the entire way. Finally, they unceremoniously tipped her out. No doubt they had wished her dead, but neither had dared stain their hands with her blood. Better this way, where she could endure a slow death on the dreaded mountains. Pray for the forbidden ones which crouched among the rocks, pray to the cold and the ice, and with time contemplate the shame of her illegitimate child, her dead illegitimate child. But she was determined not to die. There was one chance, and one chance only. She would have to climb high into the Alps. Barely out of girlhood and clad only in tatters, she willed herself to succeed. Her feet had gone to ice a few hours before, and she could no longer feel them. Her toes were black. Her fingernails, torn from her hand, were left gaping holes at the end of her fingers that had iced over. Now they were turning black too. Her lips were so dry and frozen that she had to draw back from her teeth and solidify into the ghastly rictus. She huddled against the rock. Although she had started her climb in hope and determination, even she, her natural stubbornness notwithstanding, realized her situation was precarious. She had stopped shivering hours ago. A bad sign. A creature had been watching the woman curiously for some hours now. It was far up the slopes of the mountain, peering down from its heights through eyes that could see a mouse burp at 5 leagues. Only the fact that she was below his favorite day roost made the creature stir, fluff out its feathers in the icy air, and spread its wings and launch itself abruptly into the swirling wind, angered by the intrusion. It would rather have spent the day preening itself in what weak sun there was. It was a vain creature. She saw it circling far above her. She squinted into the sun, gray specks of exhaustion almost obscuring her sight. "Stardrifter?" she whispered, hope strengthening her heart and her voice. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted a blackened hand toward the sky. "Is that you?" Chapter 1. The Tower of the Seneschal. 29 years later. The speckled blue eagle floated high up in the sky above the hopes and works of mankind. With a wingspan as wide as a man was tall, it drifted lazily through the air thermals, rising off the vast plains of the kingdom of HR. Almost directly below lay the silver-blue expanse of Grail Lake, flowing into the great river Nodra as it coiled through HR through the Sea of Tyre. The lake was enormous and rich in fish, and the eagle fed well there. But more than fish, the eagle fed on the refuse of the lakeside city of Carlon. Pristine as the ancient city might be with its pink and cream stone walls and gold and silver-plated roofs, pretty as it might be with its tens of thousands of pennants and banners and flags floating in the wind, the Carlites ate and shat like every other creature in creation, and the piles of refuse outside the city walls supported enough mice and rats to feed 1,000 eagles and hawks. The eagle had already feasted earlier that morning and was not interested in goring again so soon. It let itself drift further across Grail Lake until the white-walled, seven-sided tower of the Seneschal rose 100 paces into the air to greet the sun. There the eagle tipped its wing in its balance, veering slowly to the north, looking for a shady afternoon roost. It was an old and wise eagle, and it knew that it would probably have to settle for the shady eaves of some farmer's barn in these most treeless of lands. As it flew, it pondered the minds and ways of men who feared trees so much that they cut down most of the ancient forests once carving this land. It was the way of the axe and of the plow. Far below the eagle, Jamie, brother leader of the religious brotherhood of the Seneschal, most senior mediator between the one god Artor the Plowman and the hearts and souls of the Acharites, paced around his comfortable chamber in the upper reaches of the Tower of Seneschal. "The news is growing more disturbing," he muttered, his kindly face crinkling into the deep seams of worry. For years he'd refused to accept the office his fellow brothers had pressed on him, and now, 5 years after he'd finally bowed to their wishes and accepted that Artor himself must want him to hold supreme office within the Seneschal, Jamie feared that it would be he who might have to see the Seneschal, nay HR itself, through its greatest crisis in 1,000 years. He sighed and turned to stare out the window. Even though it was only early dead leaf month, the first week of the month of autumn, the wind had turned icy several days before, and the windows were tightly shut against the cold. The fire blazed in the modded green marble fireplace behind his desk, the light of the flames picking out on the inlaid gold tracery in the stone and the silver and crystal and the gold on the mantel. The younger of his two assistants stepped forward. "Do you believe the reports to be true, brother leader?" Jamie turned to reassure Gilbert, who he thought might yet prove to have a tendency toward alarm and panic. Who knew? Perhaps such tendencies would serve him well over the coming months. "My son, it has been so many generations since anyone has reliably spotted any of the forbidden ones that, for all we know, these reports might be occasioned only by superstitious peasants frightened by rabbits gamboling at dusk." Gilbert rubbed his tonsured head anxiously and glanced across at Morrison, Jamie's senior assistant and first advisor, before speaking again. "But so many of these reports come from our own brother leader." Jamie resisted the impure to retort that most of the brothers in the northern retreat of Gorgontown, where many of these reports originated, were little more than superstitious peasants themselves. But Gilbert was young and had never traveled that far from the glamour and cultivation of Carlon, or the pious and intellectual atmosphere of the Tower of Seneschal, where he had been educated and admitted into the holy orders to serve Artor. And Jamie himself feared that there was more than rabbits that had frightened his Gorgontown brethren. There were reports coming out of the small village of Smerton, far to the northeast, that needed to be considered as well. Jamie sighed again and sat down in the comfortable chair at his desk. One of the benefits of the highest religious office in the land were the physical comforts of the brother leader's quarters high in the tower. Jamie was not hypocritical enough to pretend that, at his age, his aching joints did not appreciate the well-made and cushioned furniture, pleasing to both eye and to body, that decorated his quarters. Nor did he pretend not to appreciate the fine foods and the invitations to the best houses of Carlon. While he did not have to attend to the administration of the Seneschal or to the social or religious duties of his position, there, for the stimulation of his mind, were thousands of leather-bound books lining the shelves of his quarters, with religious icons and portraits collected over past generations decorating every other space of wall and bringing some measure of peace and comfort to his soul. His bright blue eyes, still sharp after so many years spent seeking out the sins of the Acharites, traveling indulgently over one particular fine representation of the divine Artor, on the occasion that he had presented mankind with the gift of the plough, a gift that enabled mankind to rise above the limits of barbarity and cultivate both land and mind. Brother Morrison, a tall, lean man with deeply furrowed brow, regarded his brother leader with fondness and respect. They had known each other for many decades, having both been appointed as the Seneschal's representatives to the royal court in their youth. Later, they had moved to the royal household itself. Too many years ago, thought Morrison, looking at Jamie's hair and beard, which were now completely white. His own thin brown hair, he knew, it had more than a few speckles of gray. When Jamie had finally accepted the position of brother leader, a post he would hold until his death, his first request had been that his old friend and companion Morrison join him as first assistant and advisor. His second request, one that upset many at the court of the royal household itself, was that his protege, Axis, be appointed battle axe of the Axe Wielders, the elite military and crusading wing of the Seneschal. Fume as King Priam might, the Axe Wielders were under control of the Seneschal, and within the Seneschal, a brother leader's requests were as law. Royal displeasure is notwithstanding, Axe has become the youngest ever commander of the Axe Wielders. Morrison, who had kept out of the conversation to the point, stepped forward, knowing Jamie was waiting for his advice. "Brother leader," he said, bowing low from the waist with unfeigned respect and tucking his hands inside the voluminous sleeves of his habit, "perhaps it would help if we reviewed the evidence for a moment. If we considered all the reports that have come in over the past few months, perhaps we might see a pattern." Jamie nodded and waved both of his assistants into intricately carved chairs that sat across from his desk. Crafted generations ago from one of the ancient trees that dominated the landscape of HR, the well-oiled wood glowed comfortably in the firelight. Better that wood served man in this way than freestanding on land that could be put to the plow. Thick strands of trees were always better cut down than left standing to offer shade and shelter to the demons of the forbidden. As always, your logic comforts me, Brother Morrison. Gilbert, perhaps you can indulge us with a summation of the events that you understand them thus far. You are the one, after all, to have read all the reports coming in from the north. Neither Jamie nor Morrison particularly liked Gilbert, an unbrotherly sentiment they knew, but Gilbert was rather pretentious youth from the high-born Corlinite family, whose generally abrasive personality was not helped by a sickly complexion, thin shanks, and sweaty palms. Nevertheless, he had a razor-sharp mind that could absorb seemingly unrelated items of information from 1,000 different sources and correlate them into patterns well before anyone else could. He was also unbelievably ambitious, and both Jamie and Morrison felt that he could better observe and controlled if he were under the eye of the brother leader himself. Gilbert shuffled back into his seat until his spine was rammed straight by the back of the chair, and prepared to speak his mind. Both Morrison and Jamie repressed small smiles, but they waited attentively. "Brothers under Artor," Gilbert began. Since the unusual late thaw of this spring, both his listeners grimaced uncomfortably. The Seneschal had been receiving numerous reports of unusual activities from the frontier regions of HR. Firstly, from our brother in the religious retreat in Gorgontown, who have reported that the commander of Gorgonfort has lost many men on patrol during the last winter. The small municipality of Gorgontown, 200 leagues north, huddled for protection about the military garrison of Gorgonfort. Centuries previously, the monarchy of HR had established the fort in Gorgon Pass in northern HR. It was then and remained the most vital link to HR's northern defenses. One shouldn't expect every one of your men to come back from patrol when you send them out to wander in the northern waste during the depths of winter, Jamie muttered testily, but Gilbert only frowned slightly at his interruption and continued. An unusual number of men, brother leader. The soldiers who were stationed at Gorkin Fort were among the best in HR. They come from the Duke of Ishtar's own home guard. Neither Duke Bornheld nor Gorkin Fort's commander, Lord Margaz, expect to get through the winter patrols unscathed, but neither do they expect to lose over 86 men. Normally it is the winter itself that is the garrison's enemy, but now both Duke Bornhold and Lord Margaz believe that they may have an enemy out there amid the winter snows. Has Duke Bornhold seen any evidence of this with his own eyes, Gilbert? Morrison asked smoothly. Over the past year, Bornhold seems to prefer fawning at the king's feet than to expecting his northern garrison. Gilbert's eyes glinted briefly. These old men may think that he was a conceited fool, but he was a good source of information. Duke Bornhold returned to Ishtar during the flower month and rose month, Brother Morrison. Not only did he spend some weeks at Heisengard and Sigult, but he also traveled to the far north to speak to Maragaz and the soldiers at Gorkin Fort to hear and see for himself what had been happening. Perhaps, Brother Morrison, you were too busy counting the tithes as they came in to be fully aware of the events of the outside world. Gilbert, the brother leader's voice was rigid with rebuke, and Gilbert inclined his head as a show of apology to Morrison. Morrison caught Jamie's eyes over Gilbert's bowed head, and a sharp look passed between them. Gilbert received a far stronger censure from his brother leader than when Jamie had him alone. If I might continue, brother leader, Gilbert asked deferentially. Jamie angrily jerked his head in assent, his age-spotted fingers almost white when they gripped the armrests of his chairs. Lord Maragaz was able to retrieve some of the bodies of those he had lost. It appears they had been eaten, chewed, nibbled, tasted. Gilbert's voice was dry, demonstrating an unexpected flair for the macabre. There are no known animals in either northern Ishtar or Ravensbund that would attack, let alone eat a grown man in armor and defended with sword and spear. The great ice bears, perhaps, Jamie asked, his anger fading as perplexity grew. Occasionally, stories filtered down about man-eating ice bears in the extreme north of Ravensbund. Gorkin Fort is far too inland for ice bears, brother leader. They would either have to walk down the Gorkin Pass for some 60 leagues or shortcut across the lesser arm of the Icecarp Alps to reach it. He paused, reflecting. And the ice bears have no head for heights. No, Gilbert shook his head slowly. I fear the ice bears are not responsible. Then perhaps the Ravensbund men themselves, suggested Morrison. Ravensbund was, theoretically, a province of HR and under the administration of the Duke of Ishtar on behalf of the King of HR. But the Ravensbund was such an extraordinarily wild and barren place, inhabited by uncouth tribes who spent nearly all their time hunting seals and great ice bears in the extreme north, that both the King of HR Pram and his loyal liege Duke Bornheld of Ishtar generally left the place to its own devices. Consequently, the garrison at Gorkin Fort was, to all intents and purposes, the northernmost point of effective HRite administration and military power in the kingdom. Although the Ravensbund men were not much trouble, most HRites regarded them as little more as barbaric savages. I don't think so, Brother Morrison. Apparently the Ravensbund men had suffered as badly, if not worse, than the garrison at Gorkin Fort. Indeed, many of the Ravensbund tribes are moving south to Ishtar. The tales they tell are truly terrible. And they are, Jamie prompted. His fingers gingerly tapped his bearded chin as he listened. Of the winter gone mad, and of winter come alive. Of creatures all but invisible to the eye, inhabiting the wind and hungering for human flesh. They say the only warning that comes before an attack is the whisper on the wind. Yet if these creatures are invisible before attack, then they are generally visible after. Once they have gorged, the creatures are slimed with the blood of their victims. The Ravensbund men are afraid of them, afraid enough to move out of their homelands, and the Ravensbund men, savages as they are, have never been afraid of anything else, of anything before. Have they tried to attack them? Yes, but the creatures are somehow insubstantial. Steel passes through their bodies, and they do not fear. If any soldiers get close enough to attack, it is generally the last thing they do in this life. Only a few have escaped encounters with these forbidden ones, Morrison whispered, his amicable face reflecting the anxiousness that such a term provoked in all of them. None of them had wanted to be the first to mention the possibility. Wait, Morrison, Jamie counseled. Wait until we have heard all of what Gilbert has had to say. All three men had forgotten the tension and anger that Gilbert's jibe had caused moments before. Maragaz's soldiers have seen similar apparitions, although most who have been close enough to see them have died, Gilbert said slowly. One man they found alive, just. He died a few minutes after Maragaz arrived. He said, and this report was Lord Maragaz's own, they'd been attacked by creatures which had no form and which had suffered no wounds at the edge of his sword. And how did they wound this soldier? I thought the Gorkin Fort garrison were among the best armored soldiers in the realm. Brother Leader, Maragez understood from the soldier's last word that the creatures surrounded him, then simply oozed through the gaps in his armor until they lay between it and the skin, and then they begun to eat. Gilbert stopped for a moment, and all three men contemplated such a horrific death. Jamie closed his eyes. May Artor hold him and keep him in his care, he prayed silently. I wonder why they left him alive, Morrison wondered softly. Gilbert's voice was caustic when he replied. They had already consumed the rest of his patrol. One assumes they were reasonably full. Jimmy abruptly pushed himself up from his chair and moved over to the wall cabinet. I think Artor would forgive us if we imbibe a little wine this early in the afternoon, brothers. Considering we have the reports from Smyrna to review, I think we might need it. He poured out 3 brass goblets of deep red wine and handed them out before reseating himself behind his desk. Furrow wide, furrow deep, he intoned. Furrow wide, furrow deep, Morrison and Gilbert answered together, repeating the ritual phrases that served all Artor-fearing Achorites as blessings and greetings for most occasions in life. Both ritual and wine comforted the men, and soon they were ready to resume their considerations. And what else from the north, Gilbert? Jamie asked, holding his glass between both palms to warm the remaining wine, and hoped the wine he had already consumed would be back to chill gnawing at his soul. Well, the winter was particularly severe. Even here we had suffered from extreme cold during Raven Month and Hungry Month, when the thaw came in Flower Month, a month later than usual. In the north, the cold was even more extreme, and I believe the winter's snow and ice persisted in places above the Urquhart Hills throughout the summer. Even northern Ishtar usually thawed completely for the summer. Jamie raised his eyebrows. Gilbert's intelligence was good indeed. Did he have sources that Jamie did not know? No matter. What was important was that much of northern Ishtar had spent the summer encased in ice when usually the ice and snow disappeared by thaw month. If the ice persisted above the Urquhart Hills, then Gorkintown must also have remained in conditions close to winter, Jamie pondered. Tell me, Gilbert, did the attack continue through the warmer months? Gilbert shook his head and took another sip of wine. No, the creatures appeared only during the most severe weather in the depths of winter. Perhaps they have gone again. And perhaps they have not. If the extreme north remain encased in ice during summer, then I dread the winter ahead. And if they depend on extreme weather conditions, does that mean that they will be back? We should also consider the reports of our brothers in the retreat at Gorkintown, Brother Leader. The Brotherhood of the Seneschal had a small retreat in Gorkintown for those brothers who had preferred a more aesthetic life, spent in contemplation of Artor, to the comfortable life of the Tower of the Seneschal. Yes, Gilbert, perhaps we should. Our brothers believe that the Forbidden might be behind this. And the reasons for thinking so, Gilbert? The reports and experiences for the garrison, for one, Brother Leader, but also several of the Brotherhood reported the demons inhabit their dreams on those nights when the wind is fiercest. Jamie chuckled softly. Not reliable. You give me bad dreams most nights, Gilbert, and I am not yet ready to class you as one of the Forbidden. All 3 men smiled, Gilbert more stiffly than the other 2. Morrison spoke gently, turning the younger brother's mind from Jimmy's heavy-handed attempt at humor. Have they reported seeing anything, Gilbert? Neither Gorkin Fort nor Gorkintown has been attacked, only small patrols of individuals outside the walls. No, the brothers have actually seen little, but they have observed the mood of the town and garrison, and say that dark thoughts and moods lay heavily on it across its inhabitants. Extra prayers are offered to Artor every day, but the fear grows. If only there were someone alive who actually knew anything about the Forbidden. Jamie was angry with his inability to understand the nature of the threat in northern Ishtar. He stood up from his chair again and paced restlessly across the chamber. Gilbert, forget the mutterings of the brothers of Gorkintown for a moment. What news out of Smyrna? Unusual happenings there too, but not the same in northern Ishtar. Smyrna was the largest village on the extreme edge of the seagrass plains, the main grain-producing area of Achar. It was the closest settled area to the Forbidden Valley. If the Forbidden never came storming over Achar again, then the valley was the obvious place that they would emerge, a natural conduit out of the Shadows Ward, the darkest and most evil place bordering Achar. One day, thought Jamie, we'll take an axe to the Shadows Ward as well. The local plowkeeper, Brother Hagen, had sent reports of strange creature sightings near the Forbidden Valley, and most disturbing near the village itself. There have been about 5 sightings over the past several months. Are they? Morrison began, but Gilbert shook his head. Nothing like the strange creatures of ice and snow that the soldiers of Gorkin Fort report, Brother Morrison. Yet in their own way they are just as strange, man-like, but somehow alien. In what way? Asked Jamie tensely. Gilbert had to swivel a little in his chair to follow the figure of his brother leader as he paced the floor from window to fireplace and back again. They are short and muscular, and very dark, making them extremely hard to see at night. They evade the villagers rather than seek them out. Each time one is spotted, It has been carrying a child with it, and Brother Hagen reports that no children from the village are missing. The villagers bolt the doors and windows fast at dusk. Perhaps they have stolen children from somewhere else. You said somehow alien. Jamie stopped before Gilbert's chair and folded his arms in frustration. What do you mean by that? Gilbert shrugged. I only relate what Brother Hagen relates, Brother Leader. He was not specific on that point. Jamie sighed and patted Gilbert on the shoulder. I cannot think, but the Forbidden are moving again. Spoken words about the Forbidden were enough to make all three men shiver with foreboding. Every Acherite living knew that thousands of years previously, during the Wars of the Axe, their forebears had driven the frightful races that had once dominated Achar with their evil sorcery back across the fortress ranges into the Shadows Ward and the Ice-Carved Alps. Then, with the help of the Axe-wielders, the Acharites had cut down the massive forest that had once harbored the Forbidden races, putting the clear land under plow and civilization. It was part of the Acherite legend that one day the Forbidden would seethe back across the fortress ranges and slither down from the Ice-Carved Alps to try and reclaim the land that had once been theirs. Every parent scared their children with that threat. Jamie walked slowly over to the fire, his shoulders stooped. He raised his cold hands to the flame until he noticed the horror at which they were trembling, and quickly bunched them into fists and hid them in the folds of his gown. Though nothing as yet connected the two sets of reports from Gorkenford and Smerton, Jamie was scared that they were connected. The responsibility of his position weighed heavily on him. Morrison and Gilbert watched silently, both aware of the seriousness of these reports. Both gladly they were not the ones who had to make the decisions. Morrison scratched his chin reflectively. He knew dark events were upon them. Slowly, Jamie turned back to his assistants. Tomorrow, Carlin celebrates King Priam's name day. The celebrations will end with a banquet in the royal palace, to which Priam has extended me an invitation. He has also advised me that we need to meet privately to discuss the problem at Gorkentown. Neither Priam nor the Seneschal can meet this threat alone. HR will have to stand united, as it is never before, if we can hope to survive the threat of the Forbidden. Artor help us, now and forever. Now and forever, the other two echoed, draining the last dregs of their wine. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Please feel free to like, favorite, and subscribe for more episodes, and if you have any suggestions for novels to read, please leave them in the comments. I am Serotonin2501, and I thank you for listening to this episode of Audio Arcanum.